What if, in just one moment, every piece of ice on Earth turned into water? This is not just a random thought. It's a scenario that would completely transform our planet in a heartbeat. Earth holds over 26 million gigatons of ice, spread across glaciers, polar caps, and mountain peaks. If all of it melted instantly, we wouldn't just see a few puddles, it would be the single biggest flood in history. Entire landscapes would change before our eyes. It's hard to even imagine, but let's try. 1 second, snow and ice. The next, a planet drowning in its own water. The consequences? Beyond terrifying. The moment the ice melts, trillions of gallons of water rush into the oceans all at once. Coastlines vanish instantly. Cities like New York, Shanghai, and Mumbai are underwater within minutes. Imagine waking up in a skyscraper apartment, only to see waves crashing through the streets below. The world's ports, beaches, and entire island nations disappear before anyone has time to escape. This isn't the slow rise scientists warn about. It's sudden, violent, and unstoppable. People living near coasts wouldn't just face floods. They'd face walls of water reshaping their world forever. If all Earth's ice melted, sea levels would rise by around 70 meters. That's enough to swallow most of Florida, Bangladesh, and entire island nations like the Maldives. Famous landmarks, the Statue of Liberty, Sydney Opera House, and even parts of London, would be submerged. Countries that rely heavily on coastal trade would collapse overnight. Imagine global maps being redrawn as oceans swallow borders. Some nations would simply vanish from existence, forcing their populations to seek refuge elsewhere. Billions of people living near coasts would be displaced in an instant, sparking one of the largest human migrations in history. Major global cities would be unrecognizable. New York's Times Square would be a lagoon. Shanghai's skyscrapers would rise like lonely islands from a massive sea. Miami, gone. Mumbai, gone. Entire capitals would vanish beneath waves. People trapped in flooded buildings would fight for survival, while rescue operations would be impossible at such a scale. Airports, train stations, and highways near the coast would be drowned instantly, cutting off escape routes. The financial hubs of the world, New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, would no longer exist. Billions of dollars in infrastructure would vanish overnight, creating a global economic collapse unlike anything humanity has ever faced. With so much land underwater, where would people go? Billions of refugees would pour into higher ground. Nations far from coasts, like Nepal or Switzerland, would be overwhelmed with desperate migrants. Entire cultures and communities would vanish with their homelands, leaving behind only memories. This isn't just about land, it's about identity. Where would people from the Maldives or Venice go when their homes no longer exist? Wars over territory would erupt almost instantly, as survivors fight for space, food, and safety. Humanity would be thrust into the greatest refugee crisis in history, one we may not be prepared to handle. It may sound strange, but if all ice melts, we don't just gain water. We lose some too. Most glaciers and ice caps today hold the world's largest supply of fresh water. Once melted, this fresh water becomes salty ocean water, unusable for drinking or farming. Billions would face water scarcity almost immediately. Countries that rely on glacial rivers, like India, Pakistan, and Peru, would see their main water sources vanish. Entire agricultural systems would collapse. In other words, while the oceans rise, thirst on land would spread. The paradox is clear: more water everywhere, but less water we can actually use. The melting of all ice would throw Earth's climate into absolute chaos. Polar ice reflects Animals that
sunlight
depend
back
on
into
ice
space,
would face
helping
extinction.
regulate the planet's temperature.
Polar bears, penguins,
Without it,
walruses,
Earth would
and
absorb
seals
far
would
more
lose
heat.
their habitats instantly.
Temperatures would skyrocket.
Imagine the Arctic
Coastal
Ocean
regions
with
would drown,
no ice,
while
just
inland
open
areas
water
would face
stretching
unbearable
endlessly.
heat waves and droughts.
Species that rely on
The
cold
weather would become
ecosystems would vanish
unpredictable.
overnight,
Massive
while
hurricanes,
tropical species would
endless
be
monsoons,
forced to migrate
and devastating
or perish.
floods in some areas,
Entire
while
food
others would
chains would
dry out
collapse,
into deserts.
creating a ripple effect across
Agriculture
the globe.
wouldn't just be disrupted.
Oceans
It
would become
collapse in many
overcrowded with
regions,
displaced
leading
animals,
to widespread
while humans
famine.
compete for the
The
same
planet would
shrinking
no longer
resources.
resemble the Earth we
The
know,
extinction rate
but
would
a volatile,
skyrocket,
hostile
leaving
world
behind a
fighting
far
to
less
survive.
diverse and more fragile planet. We wouldn't just lose land, we'd lose countless species forever. Our oceans rely on ice to help regulate currents, especially the thermohaline circulation, which drives weather patterns around the globe. Without ice, these currents would collapse or shift unpredictably. Europe could plunge into freezing winters, while Africa and Asia bake under endless droughts. Monsoons could vanish, crippling agriculture across South Asia. Hurricanes could become far more intense, striking coasts with unprecedented power. Weather would no longer follow predictable patterns. Farmers couldn't plan, nations couldn't prepare, and billions would be caught in the chaos. This isn't just climate change. It's a complete breakdown of the systems that make Earth habitable. Here's something most people don't realize. Ice isn't just frozen water. It's also weight. Antarctica's ice sheet alone is so heavy, it actually presses down on the land beneath it. If all that ice melted instantly, the Earth's crust would rebound violently. We'd see massive earthquakes, sudden volcanic eruptions, and land masses shifting unexpectedly. Regions that were stable for millions of years would suddenly crack open. Entire coastlines could collapse into the sea. What began as a flood would turn into a geological nightmare, reshaping continents and triggering disasters in areas that never thought they were at risk. The global economy would collapse instantly. Trillions of dollars in property and infrastructure would vanish beneath the waves. Trade routes would be destroyed, as major ports drown in rising seas. Global shipping, responsible for most world trade, would grind to a halt. Stock markets would collapse as investors realized the world economy is gone. Nations would default on debts, banks would fail, and currencies could become worthless. Survival, not profit, would become the new focus. In a matter of hours, our globalized economy would be replaced by fragmented, desperate communities trading for basic necessities. The age of globalization would end in an instant. Agriculture would collapse almost immediately. Vast farmlands near coasts would drown, while inland farms would face extreme weather. Freshwater shortages would make irrigation nearly impossible. Fisheries, feeding billions, would collapse as salt levels rise and ecosystems collapse. Countries dependent on food imports would starve first. Even wealthy nations would run out of supplies quickly as trade collapses. Within months, famine would become widespread. People would raid stores, fight over food, and governments would struggle to maintain order. Humanity has never faced a food crisis of this scale before. Hunger, once limited to certain regions, would become a universal experience. Floods always bring disease, and this disaster would be no exception. Stagnant water would become breeding grounds for mosquitoes, spreading malaria and dengue fever. Contaminated water supplies would cause cholera and dysentery outbreaks, killing millions. Overcrowded refugee camps would make pandemics spread like wildfire. With hospitals overwhelmed and supply chains broken, medical systems would collapse. Even simple diseases could become deadly without treatment. Humanity wouldn't just be fighting rising seas, we'd be fighting invisible enemies too. The meltdown of ice would bring with it the meltdown of health systems, creating one of the darkest chapters in human survival. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your city is gone. Your home, your job, your neighborhood, underwater forever. Survivors would carry trauma for generations. Families would be torn apart as people are forced to flee inland, abandoning everything they know. Governments would declare martial law, trying desperately to keep order. In some places, society itself might collapse, replaced by survival groups fighting for resources. The struggle wouldn't just be physical, it would be deeply emotional. Humanity would be living in a constant state of fear, grief, and desperation. The world wouldn't just be wetter, it would be far more broken. After the chaos, Earth would be unrecognizable. Coastlines would be redrawn, nations erased, and ecosystems permanently transformed. A new map of the world would emerge, one with fewer countries, fewer species, and far less stability. Survivors would adapt to a smaller, hotter, more dangerous planet. Future generations would never know the Arctic, the Antarctic, or the glaciers that once defined our landscapes. History books would describe them as myths, like lost continents. Humanity would live on, but in a world that no longer feels like home. The question is not just whether we'd survive,
but whether the Earth we inherit would be worth surviving in.